God sees all. But what if those who claim to serve him are hiding a terrible secret? For decades, St. Augustine's Parish was a place of sanctuary, a place where faith was absolute, where families gathered, voices lifted in prayer, believing they were safe in the house of the Lord. But beneath the stained glass windows and whispered confessions, something else was happening. At first it was subtle, a cough that wouldn't go away, a woman too weak to rise for Sunday Mass, a deacon's hands trembling as he placed the sacramental bread upon the altar, a flu, perhaps, a passing illness, something easily explained, until it wasn't. One by one, the congregation began to fall. Fatigue, weight loss, fevers that never broke. Some dismissed it as stress, others as the burdens of a hard life. But when the test results came back, everything changed. More than 50 parishioners, men, women, even children, all infected. With a virus that doesn't spread through whispered prayers, a virus that doesn't come from kneeling at the altar, HIV. And then came the question that shattered everything they thought they knew. Who did this? Because this wasn't random. This wasn't fate. Someone inside St. Augustine's had delivered this sickness. Someone had taken the congregation's faith and used it as a weapon. And as the town searched for answers, one name rose from the silence. One face. Sister Amelia. A woman of God. A woman who had sworn to serve. A woman they had trusted with their very lives. But how does a servant of faith become the architect of a nightmare? To understand, we must go back. Before the whispers, before the illness, before Sister Amelia took her vows, before she became the monster. Faith can guide, but in the wrong hands, it can destroy. For Amelia, faith wasn't just a belief, it was her entire world. From the moment she could fold her hands in prayer, she was taught that God's house was the one place where the world made sense. While other children played outside, she sat quietly in the pews, whispering verses she barely understood, clinging to scripture like a life raft in a storm. She was different, more devout, more obedient. A girl who never questioned, only followed. A girl who believed her path was not her own to choose, but one already written by God. And for a time, that belief sustained her. At St. Augustine's Parish, she was admired for her devotion. The priests saw in her something rare, an unwavering faith, a purity of heart that set her apart. But no one recognized it more than Father Gabriel. To the congregation, he was a man of wisdom, a guiding light in a dark world. He spoke of righteousness, of purity, of the sacred duty to serve God. But to Amelia, he was more than a priest. He was a mentor, a guardian, a man who saw something in her that no one else did. At first, it was small things, a gentle touch on her shoulder that lingered just a moment too long, a compliment whispered close enough to feel his breath, a gaze that held steady when others would look away. She told herself it was nothing. He was a man of God. She was simply being blessed with his guidance. But Father Gabriel's manipulations were subtle. He didn't just praise her faith, he used it. At first, it was only whispered words in private, messages disguised as spiritual counsel. Devotion is a gift, and true devotion is a path not just to salvation, but to closeness with God. Each word carefully crafted to make her believe that only by remaining loyal to him could she truly serve God. His influence grew stronger, feeding on her naivety. He told her the strength of her faith was her greatest virtue, but also her greatest weakness. To serve God fully, Amelia, one must surrender all, even their own desires. He made her believe her purity was something sacred, something to be shared only with him, the vessel through which God's will was channeled. But faith has a way of blinding. No one knows exactly when it started. Maybe it was the private conversations behind the confessional doors, where his words wrapped around her like a serpent in silk. Maybe it was the way he spoke of devotion, not as a virtue, but as something he could claim. Maybe, in her innocence, she never realized she had been led astray, not until it was too late. At first, she felt it as exhaustion, a heaviness in her limbs that made even the simplest prayers feel impossible. Then came the fevers, the aching joints, the weight loss that hollowed out her face. She told herself it was nothing. She was fasting too often, praying too much. But then came the coughing, deep, relentless, unforgiving. She was barely 18 when the doctor delivered the news. HIV. The words didn't make sense. Not to a girl who had never strayed, never broken her vows, never been with anyone except him. At first, she refused to believe it. But then the truth crashed down upon her. Father Gabriel, denial came first, then horror, then something deeper, something darker. She had trusted him. She had given him everything. And in return, he had given her a death sentence. The moment she confronted him should have been the moment everything changed. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no guilt, no remorse, just indifference. That was the moment something inside Amelia shattered. She had spent her entire life believing in justice, that God was watching, that righteousness would always triumph over sin. But now, she saw the truth. There was no justice, no divine punishment, no hand of God reaching down to smite the wicked. There was only the powerful and the powerless. That night, Amelia knelt before the altar, whispering prayers that were met only with silence. No warmth, no reassurance, just the crushing realization that the faith she had built her life upon had abandoned her. And so she made a decision. If justice would not come from above, she would create it herself. Because Amelia did not die that night, but something inside her did. And in its place, something else was born. A woman no longer seeking salvation, a woman no longer bound by faith, a woman with nothing left to lose. And the next time Amelia stepped inside the church, it was not as a victim, it was as something else entirely. And that was when the reckoning truly began. Revenge is a slow poison. It does not strike in an instant. It festers, it waits, and then, when the time is right, it devours everything in its path. By the time Amelia took her vows, the girl she had once been was gone. To the congregation, she was a vision of piety, a young nun, barely 20, surrendering herself to the service of God. She wore the habit, she spoke the prayers, she walked in grace. But beneath the veil of faith, something else had taken root. This was not a calling, this was a mission. She had been abandoned by the church, abandoned by God. And if she was condemned to suffer, then so too would the men who believed themselves untouchable. The men who had preached righteousness while taking whatever they wanted in the darkness. The men who had stolen her innocence, her faith, and her future. But justice would not come from above. She would bring it herself. And so, she became something else entirely. A silent executioner. She moved carefully, deliberately, an invisible force in the shadows of St. Augustine's parish. She listened. She observed. She learned the rhythm of the church's rituals, the movements of its leaders, the whispered sins that never reached the pulpit. And then she began. It started with the communion chalice. A sacred vessel passed from hand to hand, lips pressed to the rim in silent devotion, a single drop of blood unseen, unnoticed, left behind by Amelia's steady fingers. It was poetic. They had preached salvation through the blood of Christ. Now, through that same vessel, she would deliver something else. Next came the wafers, the body of Christ broken and shared among the faithful. Another moment of contact, a touch that lingered just long enough. The sickness did not come suddenly. That would have been too easy. No, justice had to be slow. Lingering. Unavoidable. At first it was nothing. A cough here, a wave of exhaustion there. But soon the signs became impossible to ignore. The deacon who had once stood tall now struggled to climb the steps of the altar. The businessman who had boasted of his strength now moved with the frailty of a man twice his age. The choir leader who had filled the church with song found his voice growing weaker with every passing Sunday. Whispers spread through the congregation. Something was wrong, but no one suspected her. They turned to their faith, praying for mercy, praying for strength, praying for healing. But Amelia knew there would be no mercy, because mercy had never been granted to her. She had spent years suffocating in silence, knowing that the man who had destroyed her still stood in the pulpit, his voice calm, his hands steady, his sins buried beneath a robe of white. And yet, no one saw the truth. No one questioned. Even as the sickness spread, even as more men fell ill, even as more lives were claimed, the faithful whispered of divine punishment, of a plague sent to test them. Some spoke of a curse, others of an unholy force. And Amelia, she watched from the shadows, unseen, untouched. Justice was unfolding exactly as she had planned. But justice is never clean. And vengeance does not discriminate. Because the virus does not know guilt from innocence. It does not choose its victims with the precision of a righteous hand. And soon, it was not only the sinners who suffered. A wife, devoted and pure, wasting away beside the husband who had betrayed her. A child, no older than Amelia had been when she first entered the church, collapsing in the pews without warning. A woman whose only crime was placing her trust in the hands of a man who had sworn to protect her. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Amelia had planned for retribution. She had not planned for collateral damage. She tried to stop, but it was already too late. The sickness had taken root. The wheels had been set in motion. And then she made a mistake. One final target. One final act of judgment. And in doing so, she awakened a force far greater than she had ever anticipated. Because while the faithful whispered of divine wrath, while the congregation turned to prayer in desperate hope, someone else was watching. Someone who did not believe in miracles. Someone who did not put faith in whispers or fear. Detective Michael Carter. Faith offers no immunity. Faith can offer strength, but it cannot shield us from illness. By now, fear had gripped St. Augustine's parish. The sickness spread and whispers turned into something sharper, more desperate. What had started as a misfortune was now being seen as divine punishment, and as the number of infected grew, so did the paranoia. In the midst of it all stood Sister Margaret, always in the shadow of Amelia. Where Amelia radiated faith and devotion, Margaret had always felt like second best. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how devout her prayers, she could never escape the feeling that Amelia had the community's favor. Her envy brewed quietly, simmering beneath the surface. While Amelia's piety and unwavering devotion to the sick earned her admiration, Margaret's own efforts went unnoticed. But rather than confront her feelings, Margaret chose a subtler path. She began to sow seeds of doubt. It started with small whispers, insinuations about Amelia's closeness to the afflicted. Was she too willing to be alone with the men? Too eager to offer comfort in ways that made others uncomfortable? As the outbreak worsened, Sister Margaret's whispers found fertile ground. In the midst of growing fear and desperation, people needed someone to blame. And when Sister Margaret's whispers surfaced, the envious members of the congregation quickly accepted and spread them. It was easy for the community to turn on Amelia. She had always been the common connection between them all, so when the suffering began, it became easy to question whether she might be the cause. What began as whispers soon became accusations. Amelia, once admired for her grace and piety, was now seen through a lens of suspicion. Was she truly a healer, or had she brought the virus into their midst? The whispers became accusations. The accusations became certainty. And certainty always finds its way to the right ears. Detective Michael Carter had seen hysteria before, towns gripped by panic, neighbors turning on each other, communities desperate for an answer, any answer that would make sense of the senseless. But Carter didn't believe in whispers. He believed in facts. And the facts told him something wasn't right. He started with the victims. Names, medical histories, a timeline of when they had fallen ill. At first, everything pointed to Amelia. Then Carter found something that changed everything. A single patient file. One of the infected. A man who had tested positive before Amelia had even taken her vows. Before she had become a nun. Before she had ever set foot in St. Augustine's. The timeline didn't make sense. If Amelia wasn't in the church when the virus first appeared, she couldn't have been the one who started it. The realization sent a chill down Carter's spine. Because if she wasn't the source, then who was? He expanded his search, combing through old records, medical reports, and buried confessions. And then he found it. A name that should have meant nothing. A name that had been whispered in the background of Amelia's story, but never spoken aloud. Father Gabriel. At first, Carter dismissed it. The man was respected, revered, a pillar of the community, but something nagged at him. So he kept digging. And what he uncovered changed everything. Father Gabriel wasn't just a priest. He was a predator. There had been others, other victims, young women who had come to the church seeking guidance and left with secrets they could never speak aloud. Some had left town, others had disappeared. And then there were those who had stayed, those who had suffered in silence, those who had carried a secret disease long before Amelia ever took her vows. Carter sat back, his breath slow, his pulse pounding. He had spent his career uncovering the worst of humanity. But this was something else. Sister Amelia hadn't started this. She had inherited it. And the man who had truly unleashed this plague upon St. Augustine's parish? he was still standing at the pulpit, still preaching, still untouchable. For the first time in his career, Carter felt something close to fear. Because now he wasn't just looking at a case of revenge. He was staring into the depths of a cover-up that went far beyond Amelia. And the question wasn't whether he could prove it. It was whether anyone would let him. Detective Michael Carter had learned long ago that the easiest answer is rarely the right one. A name that had lingered in the background of this case like a shadow. Father Gabriel. Carter wanted to dismiss it. He could not win Father Gabriel. It seemed unthinkable. Father Gabriel was revered, respected, influential and generous to all. He had been at St. Augustine's for years. But then came the stories. The ones that had never been spoken aloud. Young women, broken and afraid. Confessions tainted with coercion and fear. Allegations that had never seen the light of day. And when Carter cross-referenced the medical reports, the pattern emerged. Some of the earliest known HIV cases in St. Augustine's Parish could be traced directly back to him. Years before Amelia. Years before the first parishioners fell ill. Years before anyone was willing to admit that a monster had been hiding in plain sight. Carter sat back, exhaling slowly. He had spent his career uncovering the darkest corners of human nature. But this was something else. This wasn't just a crime. This had been allowed to happen. The church had known. They had known for years. And they had done nothing. They had buried the whispers, silenced the victims, protected him. Why? Because Father Gabriel wasn't just a priest. He was a linchpin, a man with influence. He was beloved by the parishioners, but more than that, he had the ear of powerful people. Politicians, local business owners, and even members of the media. He was a key player in the town's social and financial ecosystem. The church had used him as a bargaining chip, an asset to maintain its relevance and power in Clearwater. In return for his loyalty, Gabriel had been untouchable. His generosity funded charitable endeavors, ensured full pews every Sunday, and kept the town's leaders aligned with the church's interests. He had become indispensable. To expose him would mean destroying everything the church had worked for, its reputation, its influence, its hold on the town. So instead, they let the sickness spread. They let the truth rot in the darkness. And when the time came, they let Amelia take the fall. Carter clenched his fists, staring at the evidence before him. The weight of it was suffocating. This wasn't just about one man's sins. This was about an institution built to shield its own, no matter the cost. And now Carter faced a choice. If he arrested Amelia, the case would be closed. She would go to prison. The town would feel safe again. And Father Gabriel, he would still stand at the pulpit, still lead prayers, still walk free. But if Carter pursued the truth, if he went after Gabriel, after the church, after the system that had enabled this horror, he wouldn't just be taking on one man. He would be taking on an entire institution. A battle he wasn't sure he could win. And that's when he realized the real monster will likely escape justice. The moment Amelia accepted her fate, the world believed the case was closed. She was arrested without resistance, handcuffed in the dim light of her convent cell, led through the halls of St. Augustine's like a criminal paraded before the faithful. But she did not beg. She did not cry. She did not even blink. For a woman who had been branded a monster, there was an eerie calm in the way she carried herself, as if she had already made peace with the verdict long before the law had spoken. Detective Michael Carter sat across from her in the interrogation room. The air was thick with silence. For weeks, he had uncovered pieces of a truth far darker than anyone was willing to admit. He had peeled back the layers of deception, traced the sickness to its true source, and followed the trail of secrecy all the way to the pulpit. But now, staring into Amelia's steady gaze, he realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry. She was waiting. Carter leaned forward, fingers tightening around the file in front of him. "You infected them," he said. His voice was even, but the accusation hung heavy in the air. "Over 50 people, families, children." A long pause. "Do you even care?" For a moment, Amelia said nothing. Then, a flicker of something. Not guilt, not regret. Something else. Understanding. "I care," she murmured. "But not about them." Carter's jaw tightened. "Then who?" Amelia tilted her head slightly. "You already know the answer, Detective." Carter let the silence stretch between them. He wanted her to break first, wanted her to confess to the horror she had unleashed, but Amelia did not break. Instead, she smiled. "You think I started this?" she asked. Carter felt his pulse quicken. "I didn't," she said softly. "I just made sure they shared my fate." The words landed like a blow. Carter exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against the table. "So that's it?" he said. "Revenge?" Amelia shook her head. "Not revenge." A pause. Then, justice. Carter let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Justice?" He gestured toward the files spread across the table. "You call this justice?" For the first time, Amelia's expression darkened. "Do you know what it's like to kneel before a man of God and realize that God isn't listening?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "To give yourself wholly to someone who was supposed to protect you, only to have them take everything." Carter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I was 16 when I met Father Gabriel," Amelia continued. 16 when he told me I was special. 16 when he whispered that God had chosen me for something greater. And 16 when I realized the only thing he worshipped was power. Carter studied her, waiting for the moment she would crack. The moment she would break down and admit to what she had done. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward. "You think I infected them out of malice?" she asked. "I gave them the truth, detective. The same truth that was forced upon me." Carter forced himself to stay calm. "And the innocent people?" he challenged. "The ones who had nothing to do with Gabriel, the families, the children?" Something flickered in her eyes. For the first time, she looked away. "You think I meant for that to happen?" Her voice was softer now. "That was never supposed to happen." "But it did," Carter pressed. A long silence stretched between them. Amelia's hands curled slightly in her lap. "Justice is never clean," she finally whispered. Carter let the words settle, feeling the weight of them, the weight of everything. And then he said what he had known all along. "Gabriel." Amelia lifted her eyes back to his. "He did this to you," Carter continued, his voice lower now. "And you think you're the only one who saw?" Amelia's gaze sharpened. "Do you really believe the church didn't know?" Carter felt something cold settle in his chest, because he did believe that. He had seen the signs, uncovered the hidden reports, the stories that had never reached the public. And suddenly the pieces all fit together. This wasn't just a crime. This had been allowed to happen. Covered up, buried beneath doctrine and silence. "They protected him," Amelia whispered. "They always protect men like him." Carter clenched his fists. He had spent his career uncovering the truth, but this wasn't just one man's sin. This was an entire institution built to shield monsters like Gabriel. "So you took justice into your own hands," he said. Amelia nodded. "And now you're going to put me away, while he stands at the pulpit, preaching to his next victim." Carter exhaled sharply. "You think you're innocent?" Amelia's expression didn't change. "I think I did what had to be done." The door behind Carter opened. The officers were ready. It was over. Amelia stood without resistance, her hands sliding into the waiting cuffs, but as they led her away, she turned one last time. "You know the truth now, detective," she said. Her voice was almost gentle. "Now what are you going to do with it?" Carter watched her disappear through the door. Outside, the world was ready to condemn her. Ready to label her a monster, a killer, the woman who had brought devastation to an entire community. But Carter knew better. The real monster? The real monster still walked free. And the question that haunted him now wasn't whether Amelia deserved to be behind bars. It was whether he had the power to bring down the man who had put her there. The courtroom was silent. The gavel struck. Once, twice, final. "Sister Amelia Vargas, this court finds you guilty. Life in prison. No parole, no appeal. The town of Clearwater exhaled. Justice, they believed, had been served. The monster who had brought sickness to St. Augustine's Parish was locked away, her fate sealed behind concrete walls and iron bars. And yet the question lingered. Had justice truly been served? Detective Michael Carter sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Amelia was led away in chains. She did not resist. She did not beg. She did not weep. She only turned once, meeting Carter's gaze as she was taken through the side door. That same haunting calm. That same quiet knowing. "You know the truth now, detective. Now what are you going to do with it?" The words echoed in his mind long after the trial ended, long after the reporters packed up their cameras. long after the town of Clearwater tried to forget the sickness that had stolen their peace. Because Amelia was right. The truth had not been spoken in that courtroom. The real architect of this horror had never stood trial. Father Gabriel was still preaching, still standing at the altar, robed in white, still delivering sermons on faith, on redemption, on the virtues of obedience, still touching the lives of those who trusted him. And the church? The church stood by him. They had buried the truth so deeply that no accusation could touch him. And as Carter sat in his car outside St. Augustine's Parish, watching Gabriel shake hands with his congregation, watching the men and women of Clearwater bow their heads in prayer, one thought consumed him. This wasn't over, because the most dangerous monsters are the ones we still call holy. Please subscribe now. The next chapter won't just keep you on the edge of your seat. It's the one you'll need to hear most. Don't miss out on gripping, thought-provoking stories that uncover truths, inspire change, and demand to be told. Hit that subscribe button today and join a community that thrives on powerful narratives, because the best is yet to come, and you won't want to miss a moment.